To other news now, and there's now more support for our application at the International Court of Justice to have judges declare Israel's actions in Gaza an act of genocide. Spain becoming the first European country to apply to join our case there. Already judges have ordered that Israel must stop its military offensive in Rafah. Israel's ignored that order and continues with its attacks there. So far, at least 35,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. Israel says it wants to destroy Hamas after the Hamas attacks that killed 1,200 people in October last year. Professor Anthoni van Nieuwkerk is at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs at Unisa. Professor, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. We've seen several other countries joining our application. It's a very slow sort of process. Spain, I think, the first European country. How significant is that?
Yeah, good afternoon, Stephen. I think it's quite significant. It's important. Spain is an important member of the European Union and of NATO. Plays quite a progressive role in European politics. And I would describe Spain and its foreign policy as sort of a middle power. And it is probably taken this stand not only to support the Palestinian cause, because remember the governing party in Spain is the Socialist Workers' Party. In fact, there's a coalition of two parties, like-minded political parties. And of course, they take this progressive position probably to aid in the international movement to isolate Israel. Let me put it like that. But also, if you look at Spain more generally and its foreign policy posture, it says when it made the announcement today that it's going to support South Africa at the ICJ, it wants to protect and enhance and recover the damage done to the international institutions of governance, and particularly the UN system. Of which the ICJ and the Criminal Court and so on, and the Security Council has been found wanting in bringing peace to conflict areas, zones in the world. So I think this is what sits behind the very brave Spanish decision, because it also has to cohere with its fellow EU members, which takes a very different approach to Gaza.
I mean, we've seen some debates in some countries. I mean, several European countries, at least one of them recently recognized Palestine as a state. Are we seeing more and more countries sort of joining, I suppose I'd say, our side on this? I mean, Israel, it seems, is becoming more and more isolated, even by countries or countries in blocs that once supported it.
Yeah, so indeed, it's worth pointing out that Spain and Ireland and Norway have recognized Palestine as a state, I think last week, together with a host of countries from Latin America and Mexico, I think. So there's a very broad movement underway to put a lot of pressure, and let me maybe put this carefully, pressure on the Netanyahu government to change course, to maybe agree to the three-phase peace plan that Biden introduced, which I think is maybe a coalition of like-minded countries who wants to bring a ceasefire, humanitarian aid, reconstruction, develop all of that sort of stuff. And I think Spain is leading the European way in doing that.
Obviously, I mean, in a way, we keep coming back, Professor, don't we, to the same country, which is the United States. I mean, the really strong supporter of Israel. Could the US, over time, find that its position is becoming more and more isolated as well? So this is pressure, Spain is directing this pressure at Israel, but as a result of directing it at Israel, it also sees the US coming under more pressure. And, I mean, it's hard to pressure the US to do anything, but certainly it becomes more and more isolated in its view.
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult question, Stephen, because there's also a looming election in November, towards the end of the year in America. And we don't really know what the Trump foreign policy orientation is going to be. And it's very difficult to pressurize the Americans. It's a superpower. They don't take pressure lightly or kindly, as we as South Africans know very well. And anyway, Netanyahu is very honest about what he believes in. He says the total destruction of Hamas, regardless of what the ICJ or the UN or the Americans or the Spanish say. In fact, they're very angry with these countries who are taking sides against what they perceive to be their righteous cause. They recall the ambassadors. And in fact, some Israelis say we must apply counter sanctions against these countries who are turning against us, refuse to buy and sell, and so on and so forth. I mean, but despite this, and despite the fact that the Americans and the Europeans, the Germans in particular, are really pushing and selling weapons, and a ceasefire will only happen if those players and maybe the Arab states come to an agreement to stop selling weapons and to push for peace. But how you exert influence on the Americans.
Professor, the other issue, of course, is what's happening in the state of Israel. I mean, what really needs to happen is that the Israeli offensive in Gaza needs to end. And there are a couple of ways to do that, but one of them would be for the political situation in Israel to change. And it seems that it just won't. That basically the way Israel sees this, or the way that many people in Israel see this, is that the offensive must continue even though there's no real achievable military objective.
Yeah, no, indeed. I think it's not a kind assessment to make of Netanyahu and his right-wing cabinet ministers. That coalition that is supporting the idea of a total annihilation of Hamas, regardless of the consequences to civilians. And he's trying to, I think, stretch this out as much as he can. This is Netanyahu, because his own political career is on the line. Once there's a ceasefire, I think the Israelis will say, can you now explain to us why the 7th of October happened, number one? And what is this business of you being found corrupt or allegations of corruption and you should go to court and you're trying to avoid this? It's a bit like Trump going to court, you know, for the same sort of corruption charges. And he's trying to avoid that. His political career is, and of course he wants to leave a legacy that he solved the problem, which is a very narrow victory. Release the hostages, bring back those that are surviving. In the process, of course, I think increasingly many Israelis believe that this cause is simply costing the nation of Israel and the region far too much. And by the way, I must add, maybe for another discussion another day, this war is expanding. It is spreading out into the region. Hezbollah is attacking, you know, from Lebanon, the northern parts of Israel, and the Israeli Defense Force must now cover on various fronts. And I think the real key is stop selling weapons to Israel, put pressure and sanctions on Israel, on the government of Israel, and Netanyahu's government. And then I think we'll see a change.
Professor Anthoni van Nieuwkerk, thank you. At the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs at Unisa, really appreciate that very important story that we mustn't forget amid all of our conversations around coalitions here.